Why should anybody want to read classical literature today in the age of Facebook, and Amazon, Apple? First of all, what does classical literature mean? Classical what? Classical cars, classical furniture, classical coins. What does classical mean? The word classical comes from the word in Latin, classis, a fleet or an armada, and over time and across space, this idea of a group became the best group. So a classis became a classic. And by the 18th century, classic meant the best within its group. So if we say today, why read classical literature, we don't just mean old literature, but we mean the best literature. That's what classics has come to mean. There's a lot of things written in the past that are not classic. We have about 100 million words of things written in Greek and in Latin. And believe me, most of them are not very good. I don't think any of you want to read Table Talk by Athenaeus. Not many of you are interested in reading the Letters of Fronto or a treatise on arboriculture by Theophrastus. But there are classical pieces within that larger group that we should read. And that's what we mean by reading classical literature. Now, classical literature, what is it? It's essentially things that were written in Greek and things that were written in Latin over about 1,200 years, starting with the first piece of literature, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and ending in the 5th century, 4th century AD with something like Augustine's City of God. Sometimes they're in Latin, sometimes they're in Greek, sometimes authors wrote in both languages. But across that 12 centuries that constituted the city-state, the Roman Republic, and the Roman Empire, there was a notable expression of genius, especially in the 5th century in Greece and in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC in Rome. I mentioned Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. We come to the great lyric poets like Sappho or Alcaeus or Archilochus, but you might know far better the great Athenian tragedians, Euripides, Aeschylus, and Sophocles. Or maybe you've heard of the foremost Greek historians, Herodotus and Thucydides. If we're talking at oratory, the name Demosthenes leaps out. The Greeks did not invent some genres. They never really felt at home with novels, but they were experts in things like philosophical speculation, Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's treatises. When we move to the Roman era, that really comes into its own in the 2nd century and 1st centuries BC, it's not true to say, well, Rome just copied Greek literature. For every Iliad of Homer's, there was an Aeneid of Virgil's. For every poem by Sappho, there was a poem by Horace. For every history of Thucydides, there was one by Livy and Tacitus. It not only introduced new genres like satires of Juvenal or novels by Petronius, but it reworked classical Greek genre so that the Aeneid in its own right is a classic as well as the Odyssey. But we still haven't defined what classic means. Why is Homer's Iliad more important to read today than Tom Clancy's? If it's not just because it's old, what is it about it that would make us want to explore it? Because it's very difficult to read. It's 1,200 lines written in a difficult Greek hexameter. 1/3 of the poem is repeated. It can seem monotonous to a modern student. The vocabulary is obscure. Why would anybody want to invest hours with an old piece of literature like the Iliad? What does classic, in other words, mean? It means that over time and space, 2,500 years, critics, readers, the public, clergymen, everybody in societies have applied certain standards of criticism to pieces of literature. What are they? Just what they are today. Is it beautiful? Does it move me? Does it raise great issues? Does it raise novel issues in a way that some others don't? You all know that John Steinbeck, Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Wolfe were great novelists, but you don't know the names of hundreds of other novelists that published novels at the same time. That's not because there was a conspiracy to favor Wolfe or Hemingway or Steinbeck, but because they raised issues and for whom the bells tolls, or you can't go home again, or the grapes of wrath. And they raised issues in such a way of expression, or with such characterization, or with such power of language, that they captivated our interest in a way other novelists did not. That's true then of the classics within the Greek and Roman corpus. There were certain things about the Iliad, or Sophocles, or Euripides, or Thucydides that not only other Greek writers could not emulate, but nobody since then could emulate. All of the corpus of medieval historians, all the corpus of medieval poetry, we don't really read today because they're not classics. They have not withstood the test of time and space. Let me give you another example of what we mean by classic in connection with Greece and Rome. The Greeks developed this idea of genre. It's a very interesting idea that if you're going to write an epic poem, it has to be to meter, it has to have an elevated vocabulary, a method of expression, and there should be some repetition of lines within it. If you're going to write a tragedy, it should be about 1,000 to 1,500 lines long, about an hour if you were to recite it. There should be 3, maybe 4, sometimes 2 characters, and it should rework an old myth. Let's be honest about Greek history. If it's going to be a history, it's going to be about war. The Persian Wars of Herodotus, the Peloponnesian Wars of Thucydides, the wars between the Greek city-states in the 4th century by Xenophon, the wars against Carthage by Polybius. They're not going to write about psychodramas within the Greek family. They're not going to write about building roads. They're going to write about war as history, and on and on. Now, within these tightly fitted and rather constrained genres, then the authors, poets, historians have to work. It's very confining to have to write a tragedy that's only 1,500 words long, but the Greeks looked at it a different way. They thought that it took more genius to work within parameters than to have no rules at all. Think of the difference in modern society. If you go to a high school today and college and you say, I want to be a poet, usually you just write out some thoughts, arbitrarily break a sentence where you think it looks nice on the page, and you present it and say it's a poem. There's no specific vocabulary, there's no rhyme, there's no meter, there's no cadence, there's no particular theme that we write about poets. These genres exist as they do because they have certain canons and parameters of expectation that the audience or the readership knows about. Why then read a classic, a Greek and Roman classic? Why study classics? If you were a traditional audience, and this was 1950, I have all sorts of answers that have been given over the ages why you should invest your time. One of them, of course, is that classics require discipline. Picking up the New York Times, picking up a comic book, picking up Time magazine or Newsweek does not require the same level of discipline, learning, and education as picking up a treatise in Latin, for example. Latin is a foreign language. If you read it in translation, it's translated into a difficult English often. If you're going to learn Latin, you have to learn what conjugation is, declension is. Classically, students were taught, if I study the classics, the great literature of Greece and Rome, I will be a disciplined person. It's a very funny concept, but it was actually entertained for, as I said, for almost 2,500 years. It went something like this. The student that came in and said, I want to know a Greek paradigm, was more likely to come to class on time. He was disciplined. The student who knew the classical canons of antitheses, opposition, litotes, all of these rhetorical terms, when he heard a speaker, he would say, he doesn't fit my expectations. He's not talking according to form. Now, of course, this is very confining, and we had the modern reaction against it as early as the 19th century and the postmodern in our own times that said we don't want any rules. The original argument for classics was it made a disciplined mind. Someone who understood to be a successful leader or thinker or speaker took an investment in time. That was a good reason to study classics, and it was one that was offered throughout the history of Western civilization. There was another. Just as you build a house and you want it to endure, you have to have a good foundation. So if you want to study Dante's Inferno, you won't have any idea of these various rings of hell unless you've read Homer or Virgil and you know what these classical allusions that Dante refers to are. you want to be an educated person and somebody says that's as beautiful as the Parthenon, or have you applied the doctrine of habeas corpus, or that's an ad hominem attack, you won't know what they're talking about as a learned person unless you've had this foundation in classical Greek and Roman literature and culture, art, history. So the second argument was that educated people, whether they're studying French literature or they're talking about astrophysics, they have to have some commonality, some frame of reference that they all share, and they cannot get that foundation without a mastery in classical literature. That was a second reason to read it. The third is that there's this concept about knowledge that we in the modern world have sort of lost. When we go to school and we ask students, what do you want to study? They usually say, I'm going to be undeclared. Or if they do know, they'll say something like contemporary modern poetry. And if you ask them anything outside of that area, they have not a clue. If you ask the French major, do you know anything about biology? He says, that's out of my field. Why is that? It's because we've lost this foundation in classics, and this was a very important premise, that knowledge is attainable. If you're going to explore the massive corpus of Aristotle's work, you know that there are going to be mathematical treatises, political treatises, botanical treatises, but they're going to be earmarked as such. In other words, knowledge is knowable, its extent. So when you have a person trained in classics and you ask him that question, so you're an English major, what are you studying? He says, instead of, I don't know, he says, I'm studying 19th century novels, but I don't know much about T.S. Eliot. So his area of expertise is seen in connection with not just what he knows, but what he doesn't know. In other words, it makes the universe identifiable. We think of it's just a big void, some kind of amoeba-like mass that is beyond description, beyond our powers of fathoming what it is and what it is not. To a Greek, that's not true. To a Greek, every single element of human knowledge and experience can be categorized in a particular category, a particular genre, a particular type of work. And that gave the student a sense of belonging and discipline and self-awareness of where he was, where he'd been, and where he wanted to go as far as education. Now, I said that all of those reasons were classically attributed to great thinkers in classics, great teachers, great mentors, when they wanted to convince people to undertake reading classical literature, Greek and Roman works, in the university or in the church or on their own time. But in the modern age, I think there's some other reasons why we today, in the age of Xbox and Facebook and iPhone, should take a second look at great works of Greek and Latin. And I won't try to rely on these previous arguments that I just reviewed. One is that we are losing the ability to think and express ourselves logically, not to mention in a way that's beautiful. With the onset of rapid technology, and by this I mean everything from Twitter to Facebook to email to the internet, and when you energize that with television, popular culture, what we're seeing is a compression of the English vocabulary. Listen to an athlete on television, Twitter to your friend, flip up your iPhone, and what do you hear? You hear, okay, yeah, like. And it's almost a form of electronic grunting. People, in other words, are compressing their vocabularies to about 500 words. And our popular literature, whether it is something on the internet or whether it's a newspaper or it's a variety magazine or National Enquirer, reflects that compressing vocabulary. And the result is it's a sort of boredom, that we have no avenue, no method where we can acquire new words or new methods of expression or new similes or new metaphors that make reading and speaking interesting. Think for a minute. I'll take one example. Conservatives should have not liked Christopher Hitchens, because while he did support the Iraq War, he also attacked Mother Teresa, he attacked Henry Kissinger. Liberals shouldn't like him because he supported the Iraq War, and in their sense he had betrayed them. Even though he was an atheist, even though he attacked conservative figures, they were mad at him. But that didn't happen. Conservatives and liberals, after he died, praised him to the skies. And why was that? Because Christopher Hitchens was classically educated. Not only did he master Greek and Roman literature, he was aware of medieval literature, romantic literature, and he made it a point to read as much as he could and to learn new methods of expression. And most importantly, he mastered a concept the Romans knew as veratio, variety. Without variety, everything is monotony. And the result is, when you picked up something Christopher Hitchens wrote, it was captivating. And I'll express what I mean by variety, just like Quintilian or Cicero did. If you picked up Hitchens, one sentence might be 1 line long. The next sentence might be 7 lines long. The next sentence might be half a line long. And just as his grammar and his style reflected variety, so did his allusions. And the result of that is, even if we didn't know all the vocabulary, and even if we did not know the full intention of all of these allusions, we appreciated the variety. Now, I know that sometimes oratory can border into rhetoric, and the Greeks were very aware of that, but they put an enormous emphasis that it's not just what you mean or what you're trying to convey, but how you convey it. Just the opposite of the modern notion. The modern notion for the modern student is, you kind of get what I mean. You sort of know what I'm saying, kind of like. And how you say it and how you express yourself is not supposed to be as important to your real meaning, the content. The Greeks had a different idea altogether. If you could not communicate what you wanted to say, if you could not express yourself in a way that other people would want to listen, then you didn't have anything to say. Otherwise, you could. There's a couple of other reasons I want to also touch down why a modern audience in this confusing world of ours would do well reading Thucydides' history, or Livy's story of how Rome was founded, or Horace's treatise on how to create poetry. One of them is this idea of humility. The further we get away from history in our universities, and the further students don't learn about the past, and the more the modern world seems so electronically jazzed up, and the pre-modern world seems so boring or passé, the more that we gained a certain contempt for the past. By that I mean we think that everything that happened to us has only happened to us. We break up with our girlfriend, we think, wow, nobody's going through what I went through. We've never read Euripides' Medea. Euripides covered about almost every aspect of what a jilted woman feels, a sort of Newt Gingrich wife 1 or wife 2. Marianne Gingrich went on ABC and just devastated Newt Gingrich. Wife number 2, very angry what wife number 3 and Newt Gingrich had done to her and what she as wife 2 had done to wife 1. But it was all monotonous or serial if you'd read Euripides' Medea and see what Medea was capable. Now, it's true that Marianne Gingrich did not kill the new wife, Callista, and did not kill the children, but the same level of anger was there. And so instead of saying, oh my God, this is so shocking, you wouldn't think it was shocking at all. It gives the reader a sense of perspective. If you're a young fellow and you feel that you should have been drafted number 2 in the NFL, but politics played a role, or prejudice played a role, read the Iliad. By any account, Achilles is the best of all the Greek heroes. Not Odysseus, not Menelaus, not Agamemnon. But he's not the most kingly, he's not the most well-connected, he's not the most obsequious, so he does not get the prizes that he deserves. And what happens with that? Homer teaches us that when you sulk and take your marbles home and don't play, bad things happen. And Achilles learns not to do that. Life is not fair, and the race does not go to the swift, to quote the Jewish Bible. Some women are very angry that they have more talent than their male bosses, or they have more courage. But gender roles, or the idea of women in the home, all of these issues that were so prominent in the women's movement of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, we considered this almost novel. It wasn't. Read Sophocles' Antigone. When it's a question of who should bury her brother Polynices, no one else dares to do it. Not other members of the Theban royal family, not her other sister. Only Antigone will risk doing that, even though she has to break the law and go against male hierarchy. And what's more interesting is she does that with the idea that she'll be caricatured and defamed as a woman. And she finds nobility out of that struggle and out of that challenge. So what does Sophocles say to us today if you read Antigone? All of you feminists, nothing's new under the sun. Read Antigone. Read Euripides' Medea. Read Aristophanes' Lysistrata. Read Sappho. Just as it tells us men, read Sophocles' Ajax, read Sophocles' Philoctetes. It's a way of grounding us that when we wake up in the morning, there's only 16 or 17 or 18 issues. Just like I mentioned earlier with genres being finite, so when we get up, human experience is pretty predictable. It's not fair. Those who deserve things won't get it. If we help a child or help a brother, they're more likely to resent it than show magnanimity. We think that's unusual. It's very funny how so often people around us will say, "Can you believe this?" If you'd read classical literature, you would say, not "can you believe this," but "why not?" That's what people do. So you study human nature. Now, this second reason for a modern audience to master classics is predicated on one unfortunate idea. I say unfortunate because most of us don't believe it anymore. And that is human nature is set. It's constant, predictable throughout time and space over 2,500 years. Antigone acts in the manner that women today act. Achilles acts as if he was a young kid today. Sophocles, when he writes the Ajax, understands that humans are going to act predictably. When Thucydides wrote his Peloponnesian War, he said something very famous. This will be true as long as human nature remains the same. And I say this is very unpopular or not quite thought out today. What do I mean by that? We in the modern world, somewhere in the 1920s perhaps, 1930s, thought that with greater education, with greater money, greater science, we could alter human behavior. Maybe we could take Prozac and that would change the way people act. Maybe video games would change the way that our brains are wired. Maybe taking vitamin supplements would make us bigger and stronger and act in a different way. Maybe brain surgery. All of these were efforts to make people not act as they had in the past. They wouldn't ever go to war. They wouldn't be racist. They wouldn't be mean. And yet we see more wars and more meanness and more biases than ever together because human nature does not change. If human nature does not change, then people who wrote about human nature 2,500 years ago have something to tell us. They have something to tell us in a way that's better in some ways than what we have to tell ourselves. What do I mean by that? A couple of things. Why would someone like Homer or Sophocles or Thucydides have something to tell us more about the human experience than a Tom Clancy or a George Will or a Barack Obama? One of the reasons is they were absolutely empirical. The freshness of Greek literature arises because it's not self-censored. In the modern age, if you have an idea and you were to say, you know, I've walked down the street and all the guys that are working with the sledgehammers are men. They must be stronger than women. You can't say that because the exception always trumps the rule in modern society. We censor everything that we do. The ancients can say whatever they want. There's no notion that an author's first allegiance is not to the truth. In modern American society, the allegiance is to social harmony, political correctness, but not necessarily to describe the world they see. There are some very blunt, stereotype, mean things in classical literature, but they seem to ring true. Which brings me to the second advantage of reading classical literature, given that human nature doesn't change across the ages. This is very important, remember, for a modern audience. They did not have technology. They didn't have telescopes. They didn't have computers. They didn't have sophisticated newspapers. They didn't have banks of scientific data. They were entirely empirical. When they got up in the morning, they asked questions that we do not ask ourselves. They asked questions: which way is the wind blowing? What phase of the moon are we in? When somebody was sick, they said, he's got a sore throat, he's got swollen glands, I think I can predict what follows next. In other words, they were indistinguishable from the physical world they lived in. And so when they were describing things, they were describing it as part of a natural world. If you asked a modern writer, a modern thinker, what crops are being harvested, they would not have a clue. And to the extent they would ask that question, they would say, I haven't looked it up on the internet. Something is lost in that separation of man and his environment. So when you pick up Aristophanes' comedies, he is talking about people that are part of the physical world. And they're more honest, they're more earthy, and they're reminders of what we've lost and what we should really think about returning to, at least in some aspect. So a second idea is that it makes us humble and appreciate that we're not unique and that we've lost something. That with technological progress, maybe, how should I say it, we've also experienced some moral regress. That's very important. So why should we moderns study classical literature and go back and look at the Greeks and Romans? It gives us a sense of discipline, of what we know and what we don't know. It makes us aware of the value of changing the way we express ourselves. It makes us more humble, and it gives us a recognition that we don't live in a physical world, and that's lamentable, and more importantly, that nothing that is happening has not happened before. A third and final reason why a modern audience should study the classics, and it's one that I don't think anybody makes an argument for, but I'll make it to you. All of us in a modern technological society are obsessed with health and age. We've sort of convinced ourselves, as the median age of Americans has gone from 50 to 60 to 70, I think it's up to 83 now for females that are born this year, that science will allow us not only to live into our 90s or our hundreds, but it'll be an enjoyable old age, and we'll sort of die in our sleep. So we're obsessed with this issue. And how do we deal with it? We deal with technology. We want to look young. We want to use Botox. We want to have tummy tucks. We do almost anything to keep young physically. And when people say, well, you have to think younger, what does that mean? Watch American Idol when you're 80? The answer to that was the subject of a long essay by Cicero, De Senectute, on old age. And it was one that was shared throughout Greek and Latin literature. They admitted that old age was not nice. We call it the golden years. Oh, I can hardly wait till I retire. It's going to be so wonderful. The Greeks say, this is a time when you go bald, you lose your teeth, you lose your sexual performance, you're ugly. And young people, we're so worried about young people. We think that old people are predators and young people are innocents. Young people prey on old people. They're the ones that take advantage of them. Young women smile one time at an old fool, and he gives her his inheritance, the inheritance from his children. It's a very different attitude. I think it's much more realistic and much more matches reality. But here's my point. How do the Greeks deal with that? If they knew they were decaying and that it was a natural human response to stay young and involved, how did they square that circle? And the answer is through education and learning and reading. In this treatise, Cicero says that if you start to read, if you read Plato and you discuss Aristotle and you have ideas about where we came from and where we're going, or if you want to debate whether Hannibal should have marched on Rome in the Second Punic War or not, and you're around other people and they have like experiences in education, they know these frames of reference, then what happens is the age starts to disappear. You become minds detached from bodies almost. People can stay young. Socrates is executed when he's 70, but nobody thinks he's an old man. All the people that he frequents and associates with are young. I saw this as a professor of classics for 21 years at Cal State University, Fresno. And it was a very funny thing. I had a class once where I had someone 82 years old in a wheelchair. I had another person who was an epileptic at 69, who often had seizures during class. I had another person who had had a serious stroke and was in their 70s. And then I had 18-year-olds. I had 25-year-olds. I had women with children. Everybody had a different experience, and we had a vast spectrum in terms of age. This was true diversity, not boutique diversity, true diversity. And yet, guess what happened? One time we started to read the Prometheus Bound, and all of a sudden people were saying they loved Prometheus. He was defiant. He was sort of Lord Byron's hero, who Byron loved so much, and he was resisting the authority of Zeus. And then halfway through the play, people started saying, you know what, he's self-righteous, he's stubborn, he doesn't understand what people are trying to do to help him. And as you watch them argue and translate and argue over grammar and syntax, a very funny thing happened. The people who were older were younger. and the people who were younger were older. And then when after class, somebody 19 named Juan would say to the person in the wheelchair named Rose, let's go have some coffee. Or the person who was 72 or 68 or had a health problem would go out with a very young girl about 22 to go get a coffee. In other words, for a brief moment, age disappeared. And what it reminded us of, that if you are going to lose your physical facilities, there's no reason you have to lose your mind. And the reason that you don't lose your mind is you keep expanding your vocabulary, the way you think about things, how you read, and the corpus of what you know, and the method in which you reason, which brings us to our fourth and final reason why this generation particularly should study classical literature. And it revolves around this question of what is education? What is education? It's a Latin word, ex ducere, to lead somebody from one place to another. But all education really is two things if you read classical literature. One, it's a method of reasoning. Now, there's a lot of methods of reasoning. There's the deductive method, or there's the inductive method. Where do you learn the inductive method? You learn it through Plato and Socrates, who invented it, and more importantly, you learn it in antitheses to all the other methods of thinking that were produced. The historical role of inductive thinking. It's what brings people out of the darkness into the light, to quote Plato. The second part of education is a body of knowledge. You can think inductively, but if you don't know anything, it won't do any good. In the modern university, in the modern primary school, in the modern high school, we got away from the idea of remembering things. So what is the Civil War today? Well, the Civil War was once upon a time, Harriet Tubman did this, and this was really good, and there was the Underground Railroad. We asked the student, what were the years the Civil War took place? What was the date of the Battle of Shiloh? Who was General Longstreet? What was a Dahlgren gun? They don't know anything. They have no detail. Classics tells you that if you're going to be educated, you have to have knowledge to draw upon. So if you're making an argument that democracy is good, then you're going to do it inductively by saying A and B and C and D are true, therefore democracy is good. But what are A, B, C, and D if you can't point to the Athenian Constitution or the Magna Carta or the city-state of Mantinea or Rousseau? In other words, you need things. And classics reminds us then that when you are studying things like amo, amas, amat, that's real knowledge. Or you're studying the founding of Rome, or you know who Pegasus is. Each time you pick up a nugget like that, and you won't in most contemporary literature and in most popular culture, each time you pick up one nugget, they grow and they get into a heap and they get bigger and bigger. And then as you think inductively, you pull them out at opportune times to reflect your argument. And you reflect your argument then based on data, and more importantly, based as well on beauty. You can bring these bricks into your gigantic wall, so to speak, of knowledge. But if you don't have them, you won't be able to do it. Let me just sum up then. Why read classical literature? Because they excel other things in their beauty and their argumentation and in the issues that they raise. And for a modern audience, we miss that more than ever.